Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back with another episode of Cheap Shots. This series is dedicated to showing you how to save money on the wargaming hobby, and on today's episode we will show you how to paint Khagra's Ravagers quickly and cheaply for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. By following the tips, techniques, and materials that we suggest, you can paint your miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard for less than $31, and when compared for materials that you'll need to get from Army Painter as well as Citadel, we will help you save over $162 at exactly the same time. So as you can see here in this photo, we have the Khagra's Reavers. They're going to be painted up to a beautiful tabletop standard. So that being said, let's talk about exactly how we paint these guys up. Now the first thing you need to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures as well as to prime them. Now the assembly of the miniatures is actually quite simple, and the reason why is because these are all push fit, so that's not going to be a problem at all. However, when it comes to priming though, that part is going to be kind of important, and the part that we use, of course, is flat black primer by Rust-Oleum. I get this at my local Walmart for $3.99. Now priming does a really important role, and what it does, it helps your acrylic paints to adhere to your miniatures, and that's the real purpose that you do this for. If you take acrylic paint and paint directly onto bare plastic, unfortunately, any friction of any sort will cause the acrylic paint to peel off your miniature, which could ruin the overall finish. So that is why primer is extremely important. At the same time, the color of primer that you use also has a big impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you have in your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, if you're going for a much brighter color, what you want to do is usually go with a white primer, or if you want to go for a very dark color tone, what you want to go is with a black primer. Now, since these guys are slave to darkness chaos warriors and their armor is primarily going to be black, we use black primer for these characters. And once we're done with that primer, next we got to do is a series of dry brushes. So the first color we're going to use for the dry brush is Pewter Gray by Apple Paint. This stuff costs 50 cents at my local Walmart, and I just do it all over dry brushing all over the entirety of the miniature. What the dry brushing actually does, it creates the illusion of depth on our miniatures by creating highlights. What ends up happening is the pigment of the paint actually adheres to the raised surfaces of the miniatures while leaving that darker color in the recesses. And as you can see in this photo, a lot of the details that we couldn't see earlier just from the black primer are now apparent because of the dry brushing that we did. Now we will dry brush these miniatures one more time using pale gray, fine folk art, and all we do of course is do an all over dry brushing once again to brighten up these miniatures as well. Now if you'll notice, these guys have a little bit of a chalky kind of pastel appearance, but do not worry, when we get to the actual oil washing stage, that'll actually go away and those transitions will be smoothed out. Now if you'll notice too, these miniatures are actually quite bright, even with all the dry brushing that we've done, which is actually might be thinking, well, Commander Cheapskate, how are you guys going to justify this color if the armor is supposed to be black? Well, because the oil wash is so dark, it's going to definitely mute down the grays that we did, and it's going to make these guys look overall black, which is going to look really awesome. It's a very quick way of painting up armor. In fact, if I was to play Warhammer 40,000, I would probably either play Black Templars or I would either play Death Watch and use this paint method for everything because it's a very quick way to paint up black armor. Now the very first detail we're working is on the flesh of these characters, which may seem kind of weird to say for Chaos Warriors, but they actually have quite a bit because a lot of these guys are wearing a lot of skins as well as human remains on their armor. Now for Khagra the Reaver herself, we're actually going to paint her two thin layers of flesh paint by Apple Paint. You get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And I'm going to use Taupe Gray by Anita's True Acrylic for the Sorceress in the group as well to make her have a little bit more of a more paled and gaunt kind of color feature. You can get that at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. And finally for the guy with the sword and the axe, he's got a giant hand on his uniform that he's using as a cloak clasp. I picked that at two thin layers of Nutmeg brand by Apple Paint, which you can get at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. After we get done with the flesh tones, the next thing we're going to do, of course, is to dry brush the miniatures. For the Sorceress, we're going to dry brush her skin in Pale Ivory by Apple Paint for 50 cents at your local Walmart. For Khagra the Reaver, we're going to dry brush her in Peaches and Cream by Altazo 7 Coat, which you get your local Walmart for about 65 cents. We're going to use flesh for the hand that we painted up Nutmeg Brown earlier. And once we get done with those dry brushes, next we can work on is the next major detail. And the next major detail, of course, are the leather goods that these guys have. These guys are wearing a lot of boots as well as belts on their persons. So to pick out those details, we're putting those in two thin layers of burnt umber. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. It's a beautiful dark brown color. And just put two thin coats on all the leather goods. Oh, I forgot to mention too, Khagra's top knot. We also put that color on that as well. And now that we're done with the leather goods, next we need to do, of course, is to dry brush it. And for this, we use just a thin dry brushing by Territorial Beige by Apple Paint. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. Once again, you can see the different folds and weathering of the leather goods these guys are wearing, as well as the individual strands of hair on Khagra's top knot. And the next detail we're going to focus on are on the capes as well as cloaks of these Chaos Warriors. Like I said before, a lot of these guys have wearing like the skins of animals, or at least I hope they're animals anyways, as well as body parts of different animals and things. So for the guy with the Chaos Warrior with the sword on his back, he's got like this patchwork cloak on the back of his. So he picked out that patchwork cloak in different sections. One section was taupe gray by India's acrylic, another one was basic flesh, another one was even nutmeg brown as well. We did exactly the same thing for the warrior with the sword and axe in his hands on the right hand side, and picked out all those details. And when it came to dry brushing those same fleshy details, we used Peaches and Cream by Delta Steering Coat as well as flesh to bring out those details we can see earlier. So that way we can see the individual folds of the leather goods of the skins and pelts they're actually wearing, which is actually kind of dark, all things considered. We're now going to add a little bit of color vibrancy to our fighters by focusing on the Sorceress. Now for the Sorceress, for all the flaming spell effects that she has, we picked those in 2 thin layers of Mermaid Blue by Delta Serum Coat. It's a beautiful bright blue color that you get your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. As for the warrior on the right hand side with his cloak it looks like it's made out of some kind of dragon or lizard pelt. So because of that, we decided to put that in 2 thin layers of Holly Branch by Apple Paint. Once again, you get this materials at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. Now, as for the guy who's continuing on with the detail on his cloak, to pick up those individual scales, we also dry brush that in a thin layer of lime sherbet. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And it catches upon the raised surface of the scales while leaving that darker holly brown in the recesses between the different scale joints as well. It does a beautiful job of bringing out those highlights and creating that detail. So going back to the Sorceress, we're actually going to paint her robes now. So she's actually wearing a cloak as well as a piece of chest rig of chaos armor, and then she has robes beneath that. So for the robes that she's wearing, we're using Anita's acrylic burgundy red. It's a beautiful rich burgundy color that you get at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. I put 2 thin layers on the skirt of the robe that's appearing beneath her armor, and once we got that detailed finished, we're going to move on to some dry brushing. For the magical blue fire that we picked out earlier in Mermaid Blue, we're going to dry brush that in some Sky Blue by Apple Paint. It's a beautiful pale sky blue color that you get at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And as for the skirt of the cloak that the Sorceress is wearing, we dry brush that in a thin layer of Flag Red by Apple Paint. It's a beautiful off red color that does a beautiful job highlighting really rich grit colors, in my opinion, like burgundy, for example. And I just do a quick dry brushing on that as well. And you can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And we did exactly the same detail for the rest of the fighters as well when it comes to the red cloaks. As you can see, these guys have some really big red cloaks on their backs, as well as the back of the Sorcerer, as well as the top knot wrapping for Khagra, as well as one for Warriors. For that, we picked that on 2 thin layers of Anita's True Acrylic and True Red. That cost 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. We just put 2 thin coats of that all over the armor as well, which looks absolutely fantastic. And after we got done with that, we then dry brushed those same red details with Flag Red that we did earlier. I'm not sure why I didn't take photos of the paint bottles behind these guys. I do apologize for that, but that's exactly what we did for these miniatures. So going back to the Sorcerers, we decided to dry brush the flames one more time. I didn't think the sky blue was actually enough to dry brush these, so I decided to dry brush them real quick with some pale gray by Folk Art. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. And I guess he does a beautiful job of bringing out those little additional highlights I was looking for on those bluish flames. So the next major detail we worked on are on the horns of these miniatures. So these guys actually have quite a bit of horns growing from their armor, as well as from their helmets, as well as from the head of the Sorceress. So for those colors, I used 2 thin layers of Light Mocha by Apple Paint. It's a beautiful, bright, kind of bone color, and I get this stuff from my local Walmart for about 50 cents. So just pick out those horns and 2 thin layers of that, and once again, we gotta dry brush that detail. So the next thing we started working on is on the fur as well as some of the leather goods on these characters. So these guys have a lot of belts and straps and things crossing their body. A lot of these guys got fur tufts on their coats as well. So for those details, we picked those out of 2 thin layers of Territorial Beige. It's a nice contrast to the dark umbers as well as the flesh tones that we used earlier. So things like the pieces of scroll work coming off of the actual Sorceress, the strap of the belt, the giant sword on Khagra's back, as well as the sword panels on the back of the Chaos Warrior behind her. As for the fur tufts on Khagra's cloak, I decided to pick that in some burnt sienna, which is made by Folk Art. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. It's a beautiful orangish brown color, which contrasts nicely with the red of the cloak, as well as the hair that she has as well. So I just picked that out in 2 thin layers on the fur tufts, and we're ready to move on to our next details. And one of the very last details we're going to focus on are on the grips of the weapons. If you know, these guys are carrying swords, staves, as well as battle axes, and they have like these cording going around the grips of their weapons, like for Khagra's mace, for example. So in order to create that illusion, what I decided to do is pick that out 2 thin layers of khaki paint to make it look like we got some kind of stained fabric that's been rewired directly onto these weapons to act as improvised grips for them. And for the last few details, I decided to dry brush Khagra's fur tufts real quick with a light layer of Light Mocha to make a nice little contrast to the burnt sienna that we used earlier. And I also did exactly the same thing one more time using pale gray to add that little bit more additional highlighting on these miniatures as well. Now when we get to the next slide, it's going to be kind of weird because I'm kind of jumping between the bases as well as the metallic elements on these miniatures, and the reason why is because there are some metallic elements in the bases as well, because of some really cool, interesting things that are sculpted on it. And speaking of bases, I painted the entirety of their bases with all the texture and all the ruins and 2 thin layers of Tuscan Teal by Apple Pearl Paint. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And the reason why I did this is to make it match up with some of the ruins that we have throughout the Mordheim setting on our table, as well as some of the terrain that we have that we use sometimes from Warcry, from the very first original set of Warcry as well. So I just picked out the 2 thin layers of Tuscan Teal so that way it contrasts nicely to the black and red of their armor, and they're ready to move on to a dry brush. And in order to dry brush these bases, I used Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. And what I did, of course, I put a heavy dry brush directly onto the texturing of the bases. As you can see, it makes it look like their bases standing are really dried out. It also brings a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. It also creates a lot of highlighting on those bases as well. And now that we're done with the bases, we can now start working on the metallic elements of these miniatures. So the color we use for all the silver elements on these miniatures is Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art, and there's quite a bit of that on them. The blades of the weapons, for example, their handles, the metal studs of their armor as well. We just picked all these layers out in 2 thin layers of Folk Art, and it's a beautiful, rich color. Does a beautiful job on top of it. And also picked out some of the metallic elements in their bases as well. So the last metallic element we're going to use real quick is gold. So for this color we use Deco Arts Emperor's Gold. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 6.75 cents. And we're going to use this for all the gold elements in the miniatures. So for example, the notorious spiky scroll work that you see on the rims of every single Chaos themed piece of armor, we picked all those layers out in that thin layer of gold as well. We really used it a lot on the scroll work on the rims of the shields for some of these characters, and that's where we spent most of the time actually detailing. Things like the heads of the Khagra's mace, for example, the hilts of her swords, as well as the handle, the iconography on the wizard's staff, the hilts of the weapons for the Chaos Warriors, any kind of element that we wanted to pick out in 2 thin layers of gold, and that's exactly what we did. And the last thing we gotta do, of course, is an oil wash. Now for these next few photos, I do apologize because I forgot to take photos of the next few steps, so please bear with me, I'm not a professional YouTuber. So the first thing, of course, we're going to do is an oil wash. Oil washing is a very important step, and for this step we like to use Midwax Polyshade and Mission Oak color, and we just apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the texturing of the bases, as well as the miniatures themselves. Well, now what the oil washing does is a couple of things. The first thing it does is it seeps directly into the recesses of the miniatures by bringing out those details we couldn't see earlier. A second thing that it also does too is it smooths out the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating, so you can see that chalky appearance is now gone on these miniatures. And the third thing that it also does is it darkens down the value of the colors that we're using. As you can see, a lot of that gray that we had earlier now looks black with some beautiful gray highlighting, which looks like you spent ages actually doing, but we just did some really fancy dry brushing and using really colorful oil washes to do that. It also brings the vibrancy of the cloaks, makes them look really rich and vibrant. It also brought down the tone of the bases, which makes it look more grimy and burnt out. I love using this stuff as an alternative to Army Painter Strong Tone because it does exactly the same thing, but it's significantly cheaper, which is all kinds of awesome. Now you do have to remember there is polyurethane within this stain, so you do have to wait 24 hours for the stuff to dry and cure. And the next step we got to do, of course, is a matte varnish. Now the matte varnish, of course, is completely optional. You do not have to do this step if you don't want to, but I like to have a matte finish for my miniatures, so I buy a can of Krylon matte varnish spray from my local Walmart. It costs $5.99. I just do once over real quick and does a beautiful job of muting down the sheen of the polyurethane, and then of course we rim the bases. And the last step, of course, is to rim the bases in 2 thin layers of Folk Art Skyline because it's a beautiful color. It matches nicely with the Mordheim miniatures that we also use as well. And then, of course, we're now completely done with our miniatures, and this is the end result of what they look like. As you can see, they have a beautiful tabletop standard with a really, really cheap price tag of $30 to paint up these entire miniatures. So with that being said, let's talk about exactly what materials that you need to buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to paint your miniatures exactly the same way we did, except by using their colors instead. Alright, so if you wanted to paint these miniatures up the exact same way we did, except by using Citadel and Army Painter to do so, these are the materials you need to purchase. You need to buy Thunderhawk Blue, Baneblade Brown, Longbeard Gray, Caliban Green, Wild Rider Red, Cyberite Green, Blue Horror, Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Ulthuan Gray, Slaanesh Gray, Flayed Flesh, Galferback Red, Mephiston Red, Rakarth Flesh, Rust Gray, and Doombull Brown. All those colors cost $4.55 a piece, which are 9 to 7 times more expensive than the actual stuff we use from the cheap craft store paint that we use from Walmart as well as from Hobby Lobby. After that, you'll also need to buy the colors Wildwood, Talisar Blue, Leadbelcher, Aethermatic Blue, Retributor Armor, and all those cost $7.80 a piece for those paints, which costs about 10 times as much the stuff that we actually use for our hobby paints. You'll also need to buy a can of Chaos Black Spray, which you could use, it costs you $17, which you could use as a primer, which is 5 times more than the flat black primer we use from Walmart, as well as a can of Mutatorium Varnish at $19.50, which is about 3 times more than the Krylon Matte Finish Spray that we use. And then finally, you need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32 in lieu of our Midwax Poly Shade, which is about 5 times as much for Walmart, which is the poly shade there. Now, the end result, assume that you're purchasing everything for the very first time from Army Painter and Citadel. You're talking about a grand total investment of $193.95. And when you subtract that from the Cheapskate total, which is only $30.97, you have the grand total savings of $162.98. So there you guys have it. This is how you guys can quickly and cheaply paint up Khagra's Ravagers for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. We will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.